During the early development of the Panzer IV, no one involved in the program knew that this vehicle, designed to serve as a support panzer, would become the Wehrmacht's backbone for a good deal of the war. While today, the Tiger and Panther are better known, the Panzer IV was produced in the greatest numbers and served on all fronts in many bloody engagements throughout the war. The development of this tank began in the mid-30s, leading to the first version being built, the Panzer IV Ausf. Being the first version, there was still a lot of space for improvement. The improvement of the Panzer IV Ausf. Version would eventually lead to the development of two nearly identical versions, the Ausf and C. Following the adoption of the Panzer IV Ausf, the German Army High Command was interested in developing a version of this vehicle with minimal improvements. For this reason, in October of 1937, Krupp was tasked with increasing the frontal armor protection to be proof at least against 2 cm armor-piercing rounds and installing a stronger engine. This would lead to a small production run of the second Panzer IV version named Ausf. While the development of the Panzer IV Ausf. Was underway, Wehrmacht Sechs initiated the first steps in introducing standardization of German tank development. According to the Wehrmacht Sechs plans, the Panzer IV, starting from the Ausf version, was to be built using the new Panzer III Ausf chassis, which used torsion bar suspension. For this reason, at the start of June of 1937, Krupp was informed to cease any further work on the Panzer IV chassis as soon as all Ausf vehicles had been built. As the development of the Panzer III Ausf chassis was running at a slow pace due to the introduction of a new torsion bar suspension and a new transmission, it was estimated that the first experimental chassis could not be built prior to April of 1938. The slow Panzer III Ausf development also caused a huge 8-month idling period in the Panzer IV production. As the demand for Panzer IV support tanks was great, in October of 1937, Krupp was informed to prepare for the production of 140 new Panzer IV Ausf vehicles. As Krupp was still forbidden from further developing and improving the Panzer IV chassis, Krupp officials decided to simply copy the previously built version with minimal changes. Wehrmacht Sechs' decision to cease the development of the Panzer IV chassis and the high demand for such vehicles were the main reasons why the Ausf and C were identical. Another consequence of these decisions was the leaf spring suspension would be used on all Panzer IV until the end of the war, as the planned upgrade to torsion bars never took place. Production of the Panzer IV Ausf and C was carried out by Krupp Grusenwerk from Magdeburg-Buchow. The Ausf was built in small numbers, with a total of 42 vehicles, which were constructed in the period from May to October of 1938. The production of the Ausf began in October of 1938 and lasted until August of 1939. The production run of this version was larger, consisting of 134 vehicles, plus 6 more chassis, which were used as the basis for a bridge layer version. The Panzer IV hull was divided into the rear engine compartment, the central crew compartment, and the forward-mounted transmission and enclosed driving compartment. In an emergency, the crew could use the round escape hatch door located beneath the radio operator's seat. The front hull was where the transmission and steering systems were placed and was protected with an angled armor plate. To gain better access for repairs, a square-shaped transmission hatch was located in the middle of this plate, and 2 rectangular steering brake inspection hatches were added. The superstructure was added atop the Panzer IV hull to provide sufficient working space for the crew members. As the frontal armor thickness of the tank was increased, and in order to save weight, the superstructure was slightly smaller in comparison to the Ausf. To provide sufficient working space and ammunition storage, it was still wider than the hull. It consisted of 4 welded plates, one at the front, one on each side and one at the rear, and the armored roof plates. The front plate of the Ausf B and C was completely flat, as opposed to the 3-part front plate of the Ausf A. This made the front armor stronger structurally, but also made production somewhat easier. On the left side of this plate was placed a protective driver's visor. On the Ausf B and C, the new Panzerkampfwagen 30 sliding driver's visor was used. The driver and all remaining vision ports were also protected by new 50mm thick armored glass blocks. When the driver's visor was closed, the driver would then use the KFF binocular periscope to see through 2 small round ports located just above the visor. After the spring of 1939, the majority of Ausf B and C vehicles had a welded rain guard placed over the driver's visor. To the right of the driver's vision port was placed a smaller observation hatch for the radio operator. Just to the right of this hatch, a small submachine gun or pistol port with a conical cover was added instead of a standard ball mount for a machine gun. The side armored plates were placed vertically and were curved inwards towards the front plate. A vision port was added on each side. On the left side, there was a ventilation opening for steering brakes. To protect this vulnerable spot, an armored covering was added. The engine and crew compartment were separated by a fire-resistant and gas-tight armored firewall. The roof armor plate was mostly flat, aside from the front part, which was angled slightly downwards. To gain access to their position, the driver and the radio operator were each provided with hatches located on the front roof armor. The 2-part hatches used on the previous version were replaced with 1-piece hatches. Each of these hatches had a small round port for the use of signal flares. The Panzer IV turret had a front hexagonal-shaped armor plate with 2 small observation hatches placed on either side of the centrally positioned main gun. While the Ausf A used simpler flat frontal observation hatches, the following versions, including the Ausf B and C, had a pyramidal shape. Each of the turret sides had observation ports and a 1-piece hatch for the crew. The left turret observation port did not have the small slit. On each of the 2 crew doors, additional pistol ports were added. For protection against infantry attacks from the rear, the turret had 2 round-shaped pistol ports located on the rear curved armor plate. To provide good ventilation for extraction of propellant fumes, a ventilation cap was installed on the turret top. On the Ausf B and C, the ventilation flap was protected by an armored guard placed around it. On the turret top, the left signal port received a new cone-shaped covering. At the rear of the turret, the commander's cupola was placed. The Ausf A simple drum-shaped cupola was replaced with a new model. The new cupola was better protected and had 5 vision ports, which were protected with sliding blocks. On the top of the cupola, a 2-piece hatch door was installed. Its purpose was to allow the commander to enter his position, but also to provide a good all-around view when not engaged in combat. The Panzer IV had a turret ring with a diameter of 1,680 millimeters. This turret ring was provided with ball bearings, which would allow the turret to rotate freely. The small opening between the turret and the superstructure was protected with a new type of turret ring deflector. Inside the Panzer IV, an auxiliary DKW gasoline engine was provided to power the electric motor that was used to traverse the turret. A round fuel supply opening for the DKW engine was placed on the rear left of the superstructure roof. The turret was, from early 1941 on, provided with a large stowage box mounted on its rear. The suspension consisted of 8 small wheels placed on each side, suspended in pairs, and placed on 4 bogie assemblies. The small road wheels were suspended by leaf spring units. The distance between each bogie shaft was 500 millimeters. There were also 4 return rollers on each side. At the front, 2 drive sprockets were placed, and on the reinforced back hull 2 idlers were positioned. The tracks used on the initial production Panzer IVs were 360mm wide and were connected using pins. The ground clearance of this vehicle was 40 centimeters. For a vehicle weighing 18.5 tons, this suspension system was considered adequate, but proved to be problematic later in the war due to the added weight of following upgrades. The Ausf A was powered by a Maybach HL 108TR, which produced 230 horsepower at 2,600 RPMs. With this engine, the maximum speed was 32 km per hour, with only 10 km per hour cross-country. In order to increase the speed on the Ausf B, a new Maybach HL 120TR engine giving out 265 horsepower at 2,600 RPMs was installed. The Ausf C was powered by the same engine, but modified with an improved ignition starter and a new mount. With this engine, maximum speed was increased to 42 km per hour with a 25 km per hour cross-country. The operational range was the same, 210 km on the road and 130 km cross-country. The fuel load of 470 liters was stored in 3 fuel tanks and placed under the fighting compartment. If needed, there was a valve system that allowed the crew to use the fuel of each tank individually by closing the fuel supply from the other 2. The Panzer IV's engine cooling system consisted of 2 coupled radiators placed at a 25-degree angle. The air was then sucked in by 2 large cooling fans, which were driven by a V-shaped belt from the crankshaft. This cooling system was designed to provide effective cooling in temperatures of up to 30 degrees Celsius. The engine and the crew compartment were separated by fire-resistant and gas-tight armored firewall. The crew could, if needed, gain access to the engine through a door placed in this firewall. The Alclonen SFG-75 5-speed transmission was replaced with a new SSG-76 6-speed one. The steering mechanism used in the Panzer IV Ausf B and C was of the Wilson type, which was designed and produced by Krupp. The Panzer IV turret was not centrally positioned and was actually offset to the left side of the superstructure by around 6.67 centimeters. The engine was also offset some 15 centimeters to the right. This arrangement was done so that the drive shaft did not interfere with the electrical supply system of the turret. For the lower hull, the upper front armor plate thickness was increased from 14.5 mm to 20 mm at a 72-degree angle, and the lower plate was 30 mm placed at a 14-degree angle. While the front armor of the lower hull of the Ausf B and C was thickened, the side, rear, and top armor remained the same. The side armor of the hull was 14.5 mm thick, and the rear was 10 to 14.5 mm, and the bottom was 8 mm. The front superstructure armor was 30 mm placed at a 9-degree angle. The sides of the crew compartment were 14.5 mm placed vertically. The engine compartment was protected by 10 mm thick armor at the sides and 14.5 mm thick armor to the rear. From early 1941 onwards, additional 30 mm armor plates were bolted to the front hull armor. The front turret armor was 30 mm thick, while the sides and rear were 14.5 mm and the top was 10 mm. The commander's cupola had an all-around 30 mm of armor, with the 2 hatch doors being 8 mm thick. The armor plates were made using nickel-free homogeneous and rolled plates. While the increased frontal armor provided protection from 20 mm armor-piercing rounds, the sides were still vulnerable to anti-tank rifles. In an attempt to increase overall protection from anti-tank rifles, at least one Ausf B or C vehicle was equipped with 5 mm thick armored plates. From August 1938 on, nearly all German panzers were equipped with a Nebelkerzen Abwurfvorrichtung, This device was placed on the rear of the hull. This rack contained 5 grenades, which were activated with a wire system by the Panzer IV's commander. When activated, the Panzer would then drive backward to safety of the smokescreen. The system was not very effective and was replaced with a turret-mounted smoke grenade launchers later in the war. The Panzer IV had a crew of 5, which included the commander, gunner, and loader, who were positioned in the turret, and the driver and radio operator in the hull. This 5-man crew configuration was a rarity at that time and provided the Germans with a huge advantage during the earlier stages of the war. The Panzer IV commander was positioned in the rear center of the turret. For observing the surroundings, he was provided with a cupola. For crew communication, the commander was provided with an intercom system in the form of a laryngophone. During the early testing with the Gross Traktor, the Germans noted that the commander should not be involved in any duties besides his intended role, such as loading or firing the gun. If the commander was distracted, the overall performance of the tank would be greatly reduced, as he could not pay proper attention to his surroundings. For this reason, the commander was provided with a cupola that had an all-around view and was tasked with directing the whole crew. This simple design feature gave the Germans a huge tactical advantage in the early stages of the war. For example, French and Soviet tank commanders also had to perform other roles like serving the gun or even loading, which greatly diminished the performance of their tanks despite having better armor and weapons than the German ones. The gunner was positioned to the left, while the loader was to the right of the main gun. While not in combat, the loader could use a folding seat on the right side of the turret. Once in combat, in order to get to the stored ammunition, he would simply fold the seat to the side and then stand on the turret basket floor. The driver position was on the front left side of the hull. The last crew member was the radio operator, who was positioned on the front hull's right side. His main job was to operate the FU-5 and FU-2 transmitter-receiver radio set, which had an effective range of about 2 kilometers. This radio was mounted just above the transmission. A folding 2-meter-long antenna rod with its wooden protective rail was placed on the Panzer IV's right superstructure side. The secondary duty of the radio operator was to use either a 7.92mm MP-38/40 submachine gun or a pistol, which he could fire through the small frontal pistol port. The main armament of the Panzer IV Ausf B and C was the 7.5cm KWK 37L-24. Kampfwagen cannon can be translated as combat vehicle cannon, or more simply as tank gun. The short barrel had 28 grooves, each 0.85mm deep. It had a semi-automatic breech, which means that after firing, the spent cartridge would be automatically ejected, thus increasing the overall rate of fire. The Panzer IV Ausf B and C had an internal gun mantlet, which was not too effective. Later Panzer IV versions had an external mantlet which provided better protection. The gun recoil cylinders that stood outside of the turret were covered by a steel jacket and a deflector guard. The Ausf C version received an improved V-shaped gun mantlet to improve deflection. Additionally, the coaxial machine gun was also provided with a protective mount. This was the only physical change in contrast to the Ausf B. Despite this, identification is not always easy. This gun had a muzzle velocity of 325 meters per second and proved to have a satisfactory precision in combat operations, and was even used to arm the early series of the Stug 3 vehicles. The Panzer IV was primarily meant to destroy soft-skinned targets, anti-tank positions, and infantry emplacements, and was thus mostly equipped with high explosive and smoke rounds. The armor-piercing round could penetrate 41mm of armor sloped at 60 degrees at 100 meters. At ranges of 500 meters, the penetration dropped to 38mm. The elevation of this gun went from -10 degrees to +20 degrees. The ammunition load on the Ausf B and C was reduced from the previous 122 to only 80 rounds. This was done mostly to reduce the weight of the vehicle. The ammunition was stored in holding bins, with 26 stored in the superstructure and the remaining 54 in the chassis. For the gunner's protection, a recoil shield was added to the rear of the gun. Most of the Ausf B and C vehicles were equipped with a Y-shaped metal rod antenna guide placed under the gun. Its purpose was to deflect the antenna and thus avoid damaging it during turret rotation. This gun was equipped with a TZF-5B Turmziffenrohr monocular telescopic gun sight. This sight had a magnification of 2.5 and a field view of 25 degrees. For aiming at the target, this gun sight had two engraved reticles. In the center of the first engraved reticle, there was one large aiming triangle with smaller ones on both sides. The gunner had to aim the larger triangle at the enemy target, while the purpose of the smaller ones was to help in determining the target's speed. This gun sight was quite complicated to use and required that the gunner be well trained. The second reticle was used to help the gunner adjust the main gun to the necessary range. In combat, the gunners learned to simply use the turret coaxial machine gun to determine the range to the target. The Panzer IV was also provided with a clinometer for indirect fire support. Under the telescopic sight, there were two mechanical hand wheels for elevation and traverse of the main gun. The trigger for the 7.5 cm gun was located on the traverse hand wheel. The turret was traversed via an electric motor located at the left side of the turret. The minimum traverse speed was 0.14 degrees, while the maximum speed was 14 degrees per second. When the gunner engaged the traverse, the turret moved abruptly, which made it somewhat difficult to track moving targets. If for some reason this motor stopped working, the turret could also be manually traversed. There was a selector lever which switched between these two systems depending on the needs. While the gunner would operate the manual traverse of the turret, there was a large hand crank that the loader could use. By using manual traversing, the gunner could rotate the turret by 1.9 degrees per turn and the loader by 2.6 degrees. Beside the main gun, the Panzer IV was provided with one 7.92mm MG-34 machine gun for use against infantry. The machine gun was placed in a coaxial configuration with the main gun and was fired by the gunner. The ammunition load for the single MG-34 was held in 18 belt sacks, each with 150 rounds, for a total of 2,700 rounds. Prior to the German invasion of Poland, the general organization of a panzer division consisted of 2 regiments, each having 2 panzer battalions. These battalions were then divided into 4 companies. Although these units were meant to be equipped with modern Panzer III and IV tanks, due to the slow rate of production, this was not possible. For this reason, the earlier panzer divisions had to be equipped with weaker Panzer I and II tanks, and even captured and foreign vehicles like the Panzer 35T and 38T. In the case of the Panzer IV, the situation was so critical that each panzer division could only be equipped with 24 on average of such vehicles. The few produced Panzer IVs were allocated to the so-called heavy companies, which were divided into 2 platoons, each with 3 vehicles. The primary function of the Panzer IV was to provide covering and suppressive fire for advancing panzer units. While they were used in heavy companies in combat situations, the battalion commanders would often reallocate the Panzer IV to other companies. These mixed units offered better cooperation between different types of panzers, as the identification of targets could be achieved easier. Then, the Panzer IV crews could direct their firepower to destroying the marked targets much quicker. The usual German panzer tactic was the use of the Keil formation. The tip of this attack would be formed by the Panzer III and Panzer 35 and 38T, while the Panzer I and II would advance on the flanks. The Panzer IVs were to follow up and would continue destroying any marked targets. The targets would usually be marked with tracer rounds or smoke marker shells. The Panzer IV's 75cm cannon was effective against all soft-skinned targets, but was also effective against most tanks except for the better armored ones, like the French B-1 Bis or the British Matilda. Due to the low production capabilities of the German war industry up to the outbreak of the war, only 211 Panzer IVs were available in September of 1939. At the end of the Polish campaign, 19 Panzer IVs had been destroyed, with 50 more being damaged or out of action, either due to mechanical breakdowns or enemy fire. In Poland, the Panzer IV, despite its low numbers, performed well thanks to its gun, as it could easily destroy any Polish armored vehicle. Experience gained in this campaign showed the Germans that the concept of a support tank had merit. But as the Panzer IV was only available in limited numbers, it was not possible to distribute them to the panzer divisions in adequate numbers. Depending on the source, between 278 and 296 Panzer IV tanks were available for the German invasion of Western Europe. These were allocated to 10 panzer divisions. The 1st Panzer Division was provided with the largest number of Panzer IVs, with a total of 48, while the 9th Panzer Division had only 11. Here too, the Panzer IV proved to be effective in destroying most Allied tanks except for the heavier ones. The B-1 Bis front armor proved to be impenetrable to the German 3.7 and 7.5 cm tank guns. The ineffectiveness of the German guns against the B-1 Bis can be seen during the fighting at the village of Ston near Sedan on the 16th of May. During this engagement, one Panzer IV managed to shoot 20 rounds against the frontal armor of a B-1 Bis without any success. But the Panzer IV managed to destroy the French tank's track and render it immobile. At the same time, a second B-1 Bis was engaged by the same Panzer IV, but this time, due to a lucky hit, it jammed the second French tank's cupola. The Panzer IV managed to fire another round to the rear, and this time the 7.5 cm gun managed to penetrate the rear armor of the B-1 Bis. Total losses of Panzer IV tanks during the campaign in the West was around 98 tanks. The Ausf B and C would see service in the occupation of Yugoslavia and Greece. By the time of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the number of Panzer IVs was increased to 517, with each Panzer Division receiving, on average, 30 vehicles. While the Panzer IV proved to be effective against lightly armored Soviet tanks, the newer T-34 and KV series proved to be too much for it. Despite having been built in relatively small numbers, both the Ausf B and C versions would remain in active service up to 1943. By that time, their numbers were reduced due to attrition. The surviving vehicles were given to training units. In June of 1944, during the Allied invasion in Normandy, a small number of Panzer IV Ausf Bs would be used in frontline action, where they were probably all lost. The Panzer IV Ausf C chassis would be used for testing different equipment and weapon systems. There were two versions with bridging equipment, a mobile rocket launcher, training vehicle, a mine roller, and a proposed recoilless rifle-armed version. Prior to the war, the German army was interested in the idea of bridge-carrying panzers. In 1939, Krupp developed and built 6 Brückenleger IV based on the Panzer IV Ausf C chassis. While these saw deployment on the front, their overall performance was deemed insufficient, and no more Brückenleger based on the Panzer IV Ausf C chassis were ever built. At least 3 Brückenleger IV based on the Panzer IV Ausf C chassis would be rebuilt as standard tanks in July and August of 1940 by using Ausf E superstructures and Ausf C turrets. The Brückenleger IVs, also known as the Infantry Sturmsteg auf Fahrgestell Panzerkampfwagen IV, was the second version of a Panzer IV equipped with bridging equipment. In contrast to the previous version, instead of the bridges, this vehicle was equipped with ladders that could be extended. This vehicle, in essence, used slightly modified firefighting ladders to help infantrymen cross obstacles like rivers. 2 or 4 Panzer IV Ausf were modified for this purpose. The sources do not specify if these vehicles were modified from the original tanks or made using repaired vehicles. 1 Panzer IV Ausf would be used to test the possibility of using this tank as a mobile rocket launcher. The modification included the removal of the Panzer IV turret and replacing it with a new turret with a fully rotatable rocket launching system. This system consisted of 4 280mm rockets placed in a movable and protected frame. For raising and lowering the rocket's frame, a hydraulic drive was used. In front of the rocket frame, a small armored cabin was placed where the gunner would sit. This cabin was also provided with a ball-mounted machine gun. After testing of this new weapon system, it was not adopted for service, probably due to the high demand for Panzer IV tanks. As the Panzer IV Ausf B and C tanks were recalled from the frontline service, a number of vehicles were modified to be used as training vehicles. This involved the removal of the turret with its armament and of the ammunition racks. A rail was placed around the turret hull. 1 Panzer IV Ausf was used to test mine rollers. 2 would be attached in front of the tracks and 1 to the rear to detonate mines which passed between the 2 front rollers. Due to the problems with steering, it appears that these rollers were never adopted for service. During the war, there was a proposal to mount 2 7.5cm Rücklaufflos Cannon 43 recoilless guns in the turret sides of a modified Panzer IV. Additionally, 1 more 3cm Mk103 autocannon was to be used instead of the main 7.5cm gun. The project led nowhere, and only a wooden mock-up was built. While the sources do not mention which precise Panzer IV version was to be used for this modification, the wooden mock-up shows a Panzer IV Ausf B or C hull and gun mantlet. Viewed from today's perspective, the development of 2 significantly different types of tanks which were to perform different roles on the battlefield seems odd at best. The development of one vehicle capable of performing both anti-tank and support roles would have been a far easier solution. It would have made production faster and reduced the need for production of 2 types of spare parts. Designed to improve the Panzer IV's overall performance, the Panzer IV Ausf B and C solved some shortcomings of the previous version, mostly in regard of their increased frontal armor protection and the installation of a stronger engine. Both versions served as an important element of the panzer divisions in the earlier war years. While nearly 200 of both versions were built, there was still room for future improvements, and this would lead to the development of more Panzer IV versions. That's all for this report. Make sure to follow our website. We'll be releasing new articles on the regular. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Reddit. If you use Discord, there's a link to our community server in the description. And if you'd like to help us to continue and develop and expand, consider donating on Patreon. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. I'm Nathaniel, and until next time, keep us in your sights.